Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski, and I'm excited because today I have an announcement, and that's that I'll be on the Nietzsche Podcast Halloween episode coming out, towards the end of the month. Not sure if it's going to be released exactly on Halloween or there around, but those of you who don't know, the Nietzsche Podcast is a philosophical podcast on Friedrich Nietzsche, as well as a lot of the other, characters over the years in Western philosophy, history, psychology. So if you're interested in those topics, you should go check out my friend Keegan Kjeldson's The Nietzsche Podcast. And like I said, I'll be on for the Halloween episode, which is turning into a tradition for us, I suppose, because last year we did Sadegh Hedayat's Blind Owl, and then the year before that, I think we did Lovecraft. Oh yeah, I don't remember what story we did, but we covered a few of them maybe in kind of the general topic. But in kind of keeping with the subject matter I've been talking about lately, I think I'm going to go on ahead and discuss some of Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas while we're here. And one of the most fascinating things, probably in all his works, is, as a philosopher, he's thorough, but he leaves room for infinite interpretations. But also, he covers, black, white, back, forth, all 3 points to a triangle, and then you expand that out, and then you eventually find out that things aren't what you think they are. But basically, it's kind of summed up in this line. I bring him up. I bring him up as a philosopher because he follows the traditional rules to a point. But that's kind of it, the notion that there are rules. And what he says is, in individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. So if insanity is the rule, it tells you that an individual can't be insane or go insane. They can only be themselves. They can only be what they are. Yet you put them together, the moment you put them together, that is the recipe for madness. So he has a lot of other material specifically because this isn't some vague joke. It's not just irony. It's not just cynicism. It's very well reasoned, and that, like any philosopher, they know how to carefully, or he knows how to carefully dance around the words, dance around with the words. But at the same time, he's very coherent and thorough. He predicted the coming of thunder and lightning, war and bloodshed, the likes of which no one had ever seen, insanity of which the likes no one has ever seen, and ultimately 2 centuries of nihilism, which apparently, as a visionary, as an artist who's looking at the present to see the future, he couldn't see past that because his predictions in all his work stops there, really, beyond anything that you might say is eternally recurring. Um, but these are some excerpts from Will to Power where he's explaining it. And he's talking about Christianity. And it goes, "This was the most fatal form of insanity that has ever yet existed on earth. When these little lying abortions of bigotry began laying claim to the words God, last judgment, truth, moreover, wisdom, Holy Spirit, and thereby distinguishing themselves from the rest of the world, when such men begin to revalue values to suit themselves, as though they were the sense, the salt, the standard, and the measure of all things, then all that one should do is this: build lunatic asylums for their incarceration. To persecute them was an egregious act of antique folly. This was taking them too seriously. It was making them serious." He's talking about the Christians, what drove the Christians mad. "The whole fatality was made possible by the fact that a similar form of megalomania was already in existence," right? He's talking about the Judeo-Christian religion. "And again, through the fact that Greek moral philosophy had done everything that could be done to prepare the way for moral fanaticism, even among Greeks and Romans, and to render it palatable. Plato, the great importer of corruption, who was the first to refuse to see nature in morality, and who had already deprived the Greek gods of all their worth by his notion good, was already tainted with this bigotry." And he says, "In Egypt, question mark. 246. By pressing the doctrine of disinterestedness and love into the foreground, Christianity by no means elevated the interests of the species above those of the individual. In real historical effect, its fatal effect remains precisely the increase of egotism, of individual egotism, to excess, to the extreme which consists in the belief in individual immortality. And if you take away one God, you're left giving man another. So they stop believing in religion and they believe in immortality on this earth. And it's the same egomaniacal game playing out. Okay, here we go. The individual was made so important and so absolute by means of Christian values that he could no longer be sacrificed, despite the fact that all species can only be maintained by human sacrifices. All souls become equal before God, but this is the most pernicious of all valuations. And one regards individuals as equals, the demands of the species are ignored. You could say the needs of the species are actually ignored, funny enough. Right? Like it's like the fragile, everywhere you find a fragile male ego, you'll find, kind of like the song goes, everybody wants to rule the world, right? Like pretty much everywhere you find that ego frustrated, you'll find this fanaticism, you'll find this insanity, you'll find this forever denial, projected upon them as well. That's De Boer's Society of the Spectacle. And that's also arguably part of what further enmaddens them all. Right? Because back to the initial quote, right? Individually, an individual can't be insane. Together, it's the rule. So 339, the best Christians long for the end to come as soon as possible. Concerning the needs of the individual, there seemed to be no doubt whatsoever. The duty of every individual for the present was identical with that what it would be in any sort of future for the man of the future. The value, the purpose, the limit of values was forever fixed, right? Stasis. Unconditioned, eternal, one with God. What deviated from this eternal type was impious, diabolic, criminal, or smarter than them. The center of gravity of all values for each soul lay in the soul itself. Salvation or damnation. Coke or Pepsi. Left or right. Who are you voting for? The most extreme form of you see the degradation? The most extreme form of the principle of equal rights, association with an optical magnification of individual importance to the point of megalomania. Nothing but insanely important souls revolving around their own axes with unspeakable terror. Oof. 363. Man is an indifferent egoist. Even the cleverest regards his habits as more important than his advantage. Ridiculous. 364. Egoism! Exclamation point. But no one has yet asked, what is the ego like? Everybody is rather inclined to see all egos alike. This is the result of the slave theory of universal suffrage and equality, right? That everyone's minds and feelings and thoughts are the same. That is a form of insanity. I think other people have called it blindness, but I think it could be explained by personality theory, something about how an extroverted sensory world fully orients itself in its belief, in its convictions, that it can't actually agree upon due to its own internal and external contradictions, which it produces by way of its very existence. It's not creating hell on earth, it's trying to maintain hell on earth. Give credit to my friend Quinn for that line, more or less. Not an exact quotation of his, but 365. The behavior of a higher man is the result of a very complex set of motives. Any word such as pity betrays nothing of this complexity, meaning you can try and pity him, but that has nothing to do with tragedy. The most important factor is the feeling, who am I? Who is the other relative to me? Thus the valuing spirit is continually active. You couldn't keep it in stasis even if you wanted. And lastly, this is from Human All Too Human 33. Error respecting living for the sake of living essential, right? Reality and idealism, you could say. Every belief in the value of worthiness of life rests upon defective thinking. It is for this reason alone possible that sympathy with the general life and suffering of mankind is so imperfectly developed in the individual. Even exceptional men who can think beyond their own personalities, most of you can't, and it's apparent by what you can't tolerate unless it's falsified, do not have this general life in view, but isolated portions of it. If one is capable of fixing his observation upon exceptional cases, upon highly endowed individuals and pure-souled beings, if their development is taken as the true end of world evolution, and if joy be felt in their existence, then it is possible to believe in the value of life, because that case the rest of humanity is overlooked. Hence we have here defective thinking. So too it is even if all mankind be taken into consideration, and one species only of impulses, the less egoistic, brought under review, and those in consideration of the other impulses, exalted, then something could still be hoped of mankind in the mass, and to that extent there could exist belief in the value of life. Here again is a result of defective thinking. Whatever attitude, thus, one may assume one is, as a result of this attitude, an exception among mankind. Insanity. That's what they'll call it, at least. Now, the great majority of mankind endure life without any great protest and believe to this extent in the value of existence. The last men, the ones who needed to discover that happiness. But that is because each individual decides and determines alone, and never comes out of his own personality like these exceptions. Everything outside of the personal has no existence for them, or at the utmost is observed as but a faint shadow. So, right, people are still just looking at shadows on the cave wall. Consequently, the value of life for the generality of mankind consists simply in the fact that the individual attaches more importance to himself than he does to the world. There's not a single human being alive, not a single person or group who could save the world, even if they wanted, because they're this insane. Consequently, I'll read it again to be thorough. Consequently, the value of life for the generality of mankind consists simply in the fact that the individual attaches more importance to himself than he does to the world. So if you could think of the world in which we live, where there's no longer kings and queens and royalties, but there's their shadows and the reflections in celebrity and in politics, every little person who clings and cleaves to these images and finds and derives their identity therefrom, right? Especially the political people and especially the intellectuals, right? Because I've said this before, the smartest people are often mad that they're not the ones who rule the world and have to do things like kick out the poets, right, to get rid of the competition. So there's all sorts of psychic disturbances that have happened perpetually as a result thereby, that the most primitive form of a sentient species would think that it alone is more important than the world itself, and even more absurd when that primitive, fragile, and afraid, fear-driven ego begins to think that it sits in judgment, that it has a right, that they own it. You could go on down the line as to why it's insane. But anyway, I'll go ahead and read the rest of this and probably wrap this video up. The great lack of imagination from which he suffers is responsible for his inability to enter into the feelings of beings other than himself, right? It's not because people can't or don't, it's because they generally can't. Or it's not because they don't or they won't, it's because they can't. If they could, they would, and sometimes who knows what that takes, right? People do have what we call changes of hearts and personality transformations. I just don't think it's well understood, being that it's a primitive species and our psychology is not just our psychological practices in the field of medicine. I'd say they're not just simple and primitive, they're barbaric in many ways. Like, barbaric isn't embarrassing, meaning just like nowadays someone might look back and go, oh, bloodletting is stupid, or drilling a hole in the side of one's head to fix their brain with, like, by poking it with a stick or whatever the method was at the time, because they had a method and they had reason behind it. Just like they'll say that was insane and that was absurd and that was monkeys getting into monkey business. If humanity survives, I'm guessing even anywhere from 100 to 5, probably more like in the span of 500 to 1,000 years, but maybe somewhere in that span, the species will realize just how disturbed and disturbing this all is. And maybe then man will be seen as a laughing stock once and for all. And these errors of reason and judgment will stop burdening him with false notions of original sin and shame and all these other things that have waylaid the species in its stasis. Because stasis in Eastern terms is actually called stagnation. And what you see is time doesn't stop. It will flow like water does. You can't stop water. It'll flow through the rifts. It'll wear down the strongest rock. It's just like that. But where'd we leave off here? Oh, here we go. A great lack of imagination from which he suffers is responsible for his inability to enter into the feelings of beings other than himself, and hence his sympathy with their fate and suffering is of the slightest possible description. It's shallow. On the other hand, whoever really could sympathize necessarily doubts the value of life. Were it possible for him to sum up and to feel in himself the total consciousness of mankind, he would collapse with the malediction against existence. This reminds me of the soothsayer from Zarathustra, right? The prophet. For mankind is, in the mass, without a goal, and hence man cannot find, in the contemplation of his whole course, anything to serve him as a mainstay and a comfort, right? A world of no closure. Right, that's reality. No closure, and your idealism will never match reality, because that's why idealism exists. For you to say, things are getting better, or it's not so bad, I can adjust to this, maybe never that, and then when it gets worse, you go, okay, I can deal with this, and then you find out you can, and then things might get worse, and you find out you can deal with that too. Or again, or you go crazy, or you get sick, or you die. These things all happen too. It's also part of life, and the denial of it doesn't change that fact. So, as the soothsayer, for mankind is, in the mass without a goal, anything to serve him, rather a reason to despair, right? So he's not left with a reason to celebrate, but a reason to despair. And you can hear it in anyone who's more conservative minded these days. You can hear the utter lack of understanding. You can hear how they don't even understand that they're just voices against it's wind against the wind, or wind against the flood. So if he looks beyond the things that immediately engage him to the final aimlessness of humanity, his own conduct assumes in his eyes the character of a frittering away. To feel oneself, however, as humanity, not alone as an individual. It's almost like having a culture, maybe. Frittered away exactly as we see the stray leaves frittered away by nature. Stray leaves, right? They're talking about the leaves just getting blown away, created and recreated. It is a feeling transcending all feeling. But who is capable of it? Only a poet, certainly. And remember, a poet, like a philosopher, like an artist, is a type. It's a psychological type. It's not a vague abstraction or an identity that's assumed. It's something one is or does. Like Foucault says, or not Foucault, but the guy he quoted in Civilization of Madness, the schizophrenic doesn't have an episode, they just are what they are. I wanted to cover these topics because the constant collapse of that egomaniacal Christian world spirit against not just the pagan truth of it, or the reality that it breaks up against. It shows you, I guess, again, if Nietzsche predicted 200 years of nihilism, we're barely over halfway through that, maybe 125 years. And when I look to the future, it is hard to say. A lot of other people have come to the conclusion that it seems like for a first time in a long time, it's hard to imagine what even the immediate future might be, 5, 10, 20 years, let alone 50 years or 100 years. But the nature of life is flux, and stasis is stagnation. And how it's generally dealt with, being that madness is the rule, is that by the time you're repressing the explosion from the original repressions, by the time you're repressing the explosions, you're already multiple steps down the line. And if anything, it kind of shows you like the purposelessness of it, like the notion of government, right? It doesn't exist for anything other than mainly to give people a handful of secure positions and a whole lot of people jobs. And none of that is synonymous with doing a good job or getting even the outcomes you say you're going after, such as equality or fairness, or any of these other modern mythologies, who, when people take seriously, they get mad, they lose their minds, right? It's mutualism, it's a mutual arising in conjunction with another. If we've formerly been writing this illusion of a sun chariot, these Apollonian visions of perfection, of a general type of man who doesn't even exist, if we've been riding this wave for thousands of years on the most harebrained, primitive species conclusions, which weren't correct, then again, it seems to me the Dionysian wave will be a few thousand years of coming to terms with what was unleashed to begin with, right? It all came from the past. So if you want to know what the future is going to be like, you look at the present. If you can't handle the present, usually you get mad, or you kind of check off into your own little world, your own little reality, right? You believe yourself to be more important than existence itself, so you'll prioritize yourself over the world, right? It's just impossible for humanity to save themselves, each other, or the world. But anyway, I was just following some of Nietzsche's work here, since I brought up the fact that, again, as I said in the beginning of the episode, go check out the Nietzsche podcast in general if you're interested in psychology and philosophy, and Nietzsche, obviously. And also, again, the Halloween episode will be premiering towards the end of the month, October 2024 here. It'll be a fun surprise. I think it's a really, really cool episode, and you won't find anything like it anywhere else. And other than that, there's the previous episodes on the podcast to check out, which, I'll go ahead and find the episodes and put them on a link in the low bar or in the video description. And from there, I'll just say, wherever this finds you, I hope you're well, and I'll catch you on the next one maybe. Thanks for checking out the channel. Take care. Bye.